something. Hi, everyone. Evening. We are here to get into the second podcast of IRC. And with us, we have some of the, what I can only describe as stalwarts of the league. We've got Seasor, we've got I'm a Myth, and of course, MaranelloBaby. And the topic at hand today, we're here to discuss is, I guess, a question that has been troubling mankind ever since its beginning, and that's how to be faster at the Codemasters F1 game. So some of the topics that we have today we're basically going to delve down into what makes you generally faster at the game in terms of racecraft, any assists perhaps that you cannot use, what's basically a quick and easy, not just quick and easy, but in terms of your performance, a way to get faster and quicker, not just in your unranked races, but if you're into league racing as well, generally just a better driver. So I guess the first question we have today, or the first topic at hand that we're dealing with, is learning the track and racing lines, or what makes you faster, what you can do in terms of the track or each track, and how you can use racing lines to your advantage. So we'll start with, let's say, Seasor first. Do you have any comments about how you usually look at tracks? How do you practice each one of them? How do you adapt to different tracks, and how you take up racing lines in them?
Yeah, sure. First of all, hello to everyone listening, and thanks for having me here. It's the basic thing that comes to anyone who wants to get fast in the game is practice, of course, but that's easier said than done. You have to put in a lot of time, a lot of efforts, and there are a lot of permutations and combinations involved to get that perfect setup, perfect line, the perfect gear to take. Just to let you guys know, I started this game, or until last year, till F1 2018, I used to drive with auto gears, medium traction, ABS, and all the assists were on. But since the start of this game, since I wanted to get quicker, getting rid of these assists seemed the only likely option, because I felt that I've reached the maximum speed that I could have reached with the assist. Coming back to the steps that personally, it's just all based on personal experience. I think you have to go to time trial, and you really have to sweat it out. There's no other shortcut.
Yep.
So you have to, and then once again, you have to tailor the setup as per your driving style. It's not necessary that the top guy on the leaderboard's setup is going to make you as quick as them. So you have to adopt. Everyone has their own driving style. Some prefer oversteer setup, some prefer understeer. So it's really up to the driver how they choose to drive, and they have to, of course, tailor their setups according to that. Racing line, I think, you can, as an assist, it's a really good tool to get used to the track and to help you gain a lot of pace. But racing line, what I felt, they are not very accurate for every track and every corner. Sometimes it will tell you to brake a lot earlier than where you possibly could, and sometimes they tell you to brake, much later, where you you can just overshot the corner completely. So you have to find that balance as well. And I think time trial is the only place where you can really practice and learn the track properly. Whether you're using ABS or traction control or racing line, your auto gear, manual gear, whatever settings you're using. Time trial is the perfect game mode there. And then of course, if you're a league racer, then that really helps you out to get the pace that that you're looking for.
Okay. So I think setups and assists are, I guess, the areas that we'll move on to as we progress with the podcast. But I guess specifically to do with getting used to a track or adapting to a track and how you go through corners, etc. Looking at you, Myth, what would you add to that specifically?
Yeah, so adding on to Caesar, it's not easy to learn a new track. It's just all about repeating and driving a lot of laps around the track, getting used to the corners and braking lines. So and it's just all about trial and error, in my opinion. For example, in one lap you brake a bit early. The next time you go around the track, you know that you broke a little early, so you can brake a little bit later. So you can just do this, and with more laps, you'll get to know the track better. And this is where racing lines come in. They can You can use racing lines to know when to brake and like when to turn in. So they definitely speed up your progress while learning a track.
So that's a great point. I think it's pointed out that racing lines are not always accurate, and then you have to trial and error for yourself to see how and where you're getting faster, what you're adapting to quicker. Maranello, baby, what would you add to that?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point. And for league racing specifically, it's extremely important to learn the track from even terms of which curbs you can and cannot use. As you get faster and faster, you tend to explore track limits much, much more. I know that Codemasters F1 and probably a lot of other racing games have quite a few strict restrictions when it comes to how much you can extend at which corner, how much of the curb you can use, and it tends to be a little unrealistic. So exploring the track limits both in time trial and in even open unranked lobbies in strict corner cutting is probably incredibly important. And Myth, like you said, that's a great, and BlackSheep, both of you, like you said, it's a great point that the racing lines in the game are not always accurate. So you need to understand your capability versus what the game is recommending. So don't take the racing lines as like a final decide of where you need to brake, the lines you need to take. Consider it like more of a recommendation, for lack of a better word. So I think that's the main thing about racing lines. In terms of a track, um, I, I I kind of disagree with Caesar here. In terms of understanding the track layout, yeah, short time trial can help you. But in terms of actually learning where the grip is on the track, you need to drive in unranked because I think time trial has an unrealistic amount of grip given the tire compounds and temperatures are optimized perfectly.
That's actually a good point. The whole racing line, I think, conversation leads us quite seamless into our next segment of conversation, and that's specifically to do with following a line or taking a corner, or more accurately, the phases of taking a corner, how you enter, how you exit, whether you take early apex at some points or whether you late apex at other points. Caesar, I'll let you take it away this time. Do you have a specific way that you deal with different corners? Do you have a strategy? Do you have phases that you certainly follow at all times? Or is it usually just based on how you're feeling or how the car is feeling as you enter?
Yeah, the main thing is, of course, you have to know how the car is behaving on the track. It's not necessary that the setup that you have mastered yourself into from time trial that will work in, let's say, league races. So you'll have to tweak that a bit. So you have to maybe practice that in a Grand Prix mode or do it a session with your friends and then see how that setup works in a league setting lobby where tire wear and fuel are into effect. Uh, Coming to how you taking a corner, one technique or strategy that I use is if I know there's a long stretch of, or rather a long straight that's coming up after a corner. What I usually do is I always take it slow and fast out because I
Sure.
want to maximize the top end speed of my car. So obviously in qualifying, that helps a lot. In race, if you're behind someone, that's even better. But from qualifying perspective, or in a general racing point of view, I think slow and fast out is what has really helped me. But as I said, this is only when I know the straight. There's a long straight coming up after a corner. But if it's normal, it's not too much of a long corner. It's just a banged corner that doesn't take too long to come into another turn. I take it. I really attack the corner then. The exit speed isn't much of a priority for me. But unless again, if you're behind someone, you're following someone, and you have to attack them, then I think your strategy changes a bit because you don't want to hit them from the back, and you need to ensure that your exit speed is at the maximum it can be if you want to make an overtake move. So depending on what the situation is that's what I'm saying. If you're following someone, then I follow a different strategy. If I'm alone by myself or in a qualifying session, it's a different strategy altogether for me.
Great. You made some really good points about the whole slow in, fast out thing, and that it can vary based on what conditions you're in, whether it's qualifying or how helpful it can be when you're right behind somebody. Others, feel free to jump in, guys. What do you feel about specifically taking a corner?
Yeah, so obviously there are different corners and it depends on the corner. Some have a single
course.
apex, some have double apexes, and some you don't even need to hit the apex. That's not the fastest way around. So it's just all about experimenting on the the racing lines, and the fastest way you can take it. But the general rule is slow and fast out. And these lines can also vary depending on track, temperature, weather, and sometimes you can even exploit track limits. As we see in the F1 2019 game, you can go outside the white line quite a bit. So yeah, but generally for slow corners, the best thing is to use up as much track as possible and braking and just hitting the apex and taking quite a good exit out.
Yeah, just one more point I'd like to add, that one more thing that, and I'm sure everyone here uses that technique, including myself, is in a corners that are really slow, for example, Monza turn 2, where you need a good exit speed. Short shifting really helps to have a better launch of that corner. So, anyway, I mean, not just at Monza, but any track that has slow corners or which needs to be taken, or at least the entry needs to be taken in the first gear, preferably. I think short shifting really helps to get a good launch, going towards the next corner.
Well, in terms of the go ahead, man. Okay, I was just going to add to that point in terms of technique for a corner is something that I specifically have been struggling with or have been trying to improve of late is specifically braking in a straight line before a corner. I know there's some corners where it's basically a continual curve and then you kind of have to brake somewhere in the middle. Let's say turn 1 in Japan, it's quite difficult to get your braking in a straight line. Maranello, feel free to add to that. I just thought that was a point pertinent.
Yeah, I think braking in a straight line is incredibly important. There are some corners where you can turn slightly, but coming back to your point, Seasor, I think you made a very interesting point about short shifting on traction, and I think a few Formula One drivers who've actually driven this game, especially in this whole last 2-month period, Leclerc leading the charge among them. Sorry, I just had to say that. But
Of course.
Yes.
yeah, so they've actually said that the traction on this game is probably more sensitive than traction in real life racing cars. So that's I think short shifting can really help you there. But coming back to the initial point about the 3 phases of a corner, and I think braking in a straight line is important. As you lift off the brake, you can kind of move the steering wheel towards the apex. Um, and it's important to kind of get the car pointed where you want it to go as soon as possible. So probably keeping the corner tight for slow corners. For example, let's look at turn 4. Turn 4 is the hairpin in Germany, right? Yeah.
Yep.
2,
Yep.
3, yeah.
Correct.
as a hairpin.
So what I tend to do is I tend to brake, and while I'm braking, I go onto the outside curb. And I think that kind of ties back into the first point about learning the tracks, because um, you can't take a corner properly until you know which curbs you can brake on. Uh, once you've and I think Faizan asked a question about trail braking. So you have to slam on the brake and kind of lift off the brake as you reach the apex. And once you reach the apex, you can start turning in. Like I take a kind of cutback line at turn 4 in Germany. I don't know if Myth and Caesar you do it as well, but I kind of take a cutback line in Germany because I think the run up to turn 5 and 6 is where you can gain a lot of time.
Hmm.
So I think I think that's another important aspect. So while trail braking, you can possibly move onto the curb if you're not confident on going 100% on the brakes on the curb itself.
Something I can try next time I'm in Germany. Good point.
I
Right.
think I'm the only one
Very
here who plays
interesting.
on a controller, and I usually find that there's some
No,
corners where
I'm.
are you
Wait,
are you
I'm on a controller as well.
Oh, fantastic. So maybe you can give me some feedback on whether I'm doing something wrong here. So I find a few corners where taking the apex is a little bit more difficult for me in getting, basically the steering angle to be straight at the exit of the corner. And I just altogether avoid the apex and try to stick to the track to have much more traction and not get the apex to unsettle the car. Is that something everybody encounters? Is that just me?
I think it's just you.
Okay.
The steering
All right.
lock. I mean, I don't find difficulty in turning the car in if I want to. I mean, I've heard a lot of guys complain who are on a controller that they find it challenging to, get the car to rotate. I hope that's what your point is,
So I'll
if
give you
I'm
an
not wrong.
example. So let's
Yeah.
think of Belgium when you're running down
Hmm.
to the right-hander after is that Pouon, and in that sort of corner, the curb is slightly dipped, and I tend to encounter a lot of unsettlement of the car if I jump on that curb or take that apex.
I think that curb is meant to unsettle your car. I don't think anyone can ride that curb if they want to. Not sure about Amit or Maranello if you guys take the curb.
I think in the entry, the first right hander has the curb.
Hmm.
I think that's you can take that one, and on the exit, it's probably a bit dipped. I'm not sure. Maybe it's the other way around, but I actually take both curbs.
Oh, you do
I
okay. I personally avoid that curb specifically altogether.
I'm on a
Not
different
worth
tangent
it.
here, and I'm not able to figure out which corner you guys are talking about.
It's the right left chicane after Puan.
Right. No, I take both curbs.
Yeah.
So I think if you brake in a straight line, I think if you'll probably be in fourth gear about then on turn in. You can kind of feather the throttle to the first right-hander, and then you short shift
Yeah,
up to fifth
exactly.
for the
Yeah.
second left-hander, and the car kind of drifts wide onto the curb, so there's more than enough traction available.
Fair. I think that's a sum up of the fact that it's just me doing that. Okay. I think let's move on to a bit of race pace or race trim and how you carry out your driving and how you change that and adapt to race conditions. I think one of the first things we'll start with is fuel and ERS management. And now we know that the whole ERS management thing is not going to be as significant as it is perhaps in F1 2019 going on to the next game, but there will obviously be elements of that where you still have to manage, deploy that as and when you overtake. So yeah, let's kick off with Caesar again. Let's continue the order. Do you have a specific way or a strategy for every track where you know where to deploy what kind of ERS and what fuel mix to be in after every corner or every sector of the track?
There are many combinations, so I'm not really sure if I'll be able to run through everything. But just to give you a general idea, of course, yeah, it's different for every track, every sector, and every weather conditions. So dry has a different strategy for ERS and fuel management. Wet has a separate one. But just to give you a general idea, for a dry conditioned race, if I know, I'll start with ERS management first. If I know, or if I'm behind someone, let's say if I'm following someone and I know that there's no overtake opportunity available, I try to save as much ERS as possible behind the car that I'm following, because there's no
Sure.
point burning your ERS out. in a bid to stay with them, because the slipstream is strong enough. I wouldn't say the strongest, but it's strong enough to keep you close up behind them. And that also gives me the opportunity to save some fuel along with that. And of course, once I see the opportunity to make the overtake, or if I have very few laps remaining towards the race end, that's when I can really attack with my ERS and fuel. On the flip side, if I'm the leading car, it's really challenging to manage your ERS, because the guy behind will be saving up all the ERS in the world, and you will be burning up ERS just in a bit to stay in front of the car.
Well, you'll just be more vulnerable. Yeah.
So we'll be exactly. So we'll be much more in the stage of getting attacked in any given opportunity. So it's really, it comes to the case of what this scenario you're in. If you're behind someone, obviously save as much ERS as possible, and if you're in front, well, the way the game works, you really have to properly manage. For example, I'll just give you an example. In a track like Hungary, in sector 2, what I do, if for example, if I'm the lead car, I set my ERS to none, because I know in a league race scenario where there's like next to zero opportunity for a driver behind to overtake, I just switch it off. I know the driver behind will stay behind, and that will give me the perfect opportunity to save as much ERS as I want, and then I can use it all up or most of it in the sector 1 to stay in front. So you have to adopt according to different tracks you're in, which sectors you're in. Of course, sectors strategy always vary. For fuel wise, again, it's a bit different. I won't say exactly the same, because of course you need to save the fuel as well. But saving too much, again, what I've personally experienced, I'm not sure about the other guys here. What I experienced is saving too much fuel makes the car really heavy towards the end to have maximum corner speed as much as I would have liked. So I usually tend to keep my fuel setting as standard. Helps me keep pace with the guy in front, and engine temps are always in check, and I really come across driver in front pulling away from me in case they've saved up more ERS, or they're saving heavy fuel. So standard, and you can say medium to high is what my standard ERS setting is, standard for the fuel, and medium to high is when I'm really pushing my car, or if I'm attacking someone. Overtake and hot lap I avoid as much as I can, because they just burn the ERS what do you call it, harvest whatever I've harvested. Overtake and hot lap just burns it up too quickly for in this game. It wasn't that bad in 2018, but 2019 Codemasters have really stepped that up. So high is what I go at maximum, unless of course I'm overtaking someone, then I switch it up. But it's usually none, medium. I switch between these two. Low, I avoid.
So actually, Seasor, on that point about kind of harvesting ERS and in general, I think you've spoken like somebody who has true pace to have the luxury to do that. But I've actually found that hot lap doesn't burn ERS as much as overtake does. But
not as much as overtake.
And the pace difference isn't much. So I actually, if I'm conserving, I tend to go to none in the corners and hot lap on the straights instead of overtake. I find the pace difference is a few hundredths of a second or a few thousandths of a second, and it's not really and sometimes it's not worth going to overtake at all. Apologies for the background noise, my cat's gone crazy. But I think this also ties kind of into tire management, because if you run like on tracks like USA Sector 1, Hungary Sector 2 and 3, like you mentioned earlier, and even tracks like Singapore, if you run none and lean through the corners, you tend to also keep your tire temps low, and that is incredibly important at some of these tracks. And I think
absolutely
that definitely helps you gain time.
That's correct. So I agree with both of you.
Just one more thing, Amit, before I forget. The thing that you said about overtake and hot lap and not finding enough difference. The only thing, and I'm sure most of the guys don't know about this, but overtake, if you set your ERS to overtake, and especially if you are in your qualifying session, uh, on a long straight, overtake will give you a better top end speed than hot lap. So if, for example, if you are in your 7th gear or 8th gear and you want the maximum top end speed, overtake is the ERS to go with rather than a hot lap. So I'm sure you guys do the same, but I've been asked this a lot. What ERS management do you do? Because people who have seen my hot laps during league races, they notice that I switch a lot between my ERS during the qualifying runs. So that's what I tell them, that if you're on a straight and you want to top in speed, overtake is the setting to go. But deploy it only when you are in a higher gear. That's only when it's beneficial.
And I think to close on that point, it's incredibly important to practice it. So what I was do for some of the more casual league races that I take part in, I tend to like underfuel the car majorly, and I think I take it as a challenge on myself to sort of stay relevant in the race without having extra fuel to play with. So that's probably something that all of you can actually try.
This is something that I do in wet races. I underfuel my car to maybe minus 0.5 or maximum to 0.5. That's what I do, because I know that I'll be saving a lot of fuel through lean settings.
Yeah, especially in the wet, I underfuel the car like up to 2 laps. Because in the wet, putting your fuel down to low is actually much more beneficial because you have a lot more traction.
True.
And in dry, actually, I always overfuel my car to like about 3 to 4 laps because I found that there
Same.
isn't actually much of a difference from having no extra fuel to like having 4 laps extra fuel. It doesn't really make a difference, and you always have extra fuel to play with when you want to overtake or defend against someone. You can always use the rich mode.
Yeah, but I think engine temp management is important if you're overfueling your car, because like you said, even I go for 3.5 laps of overfuel in dry races, but you cannot leave obviously in your rich fuel setting mode, because once engine temps go up, and what I've experienced quite a few times, unfortunately, I get no top end speed at all, and no acceleration as well. So as long as one can manage the engine temps, I think overfueling obviously doesn't have that much of a disadvantage.
So I'll make a point in the same regard, and I don't fully agree with that point, Myth, because I've usually found that if you overfuel by about, let's say, 4 laps or so, then it kind of plays on, at least on my mind, that there's a lot of fuel, and then it's weighing the car down, and then I have to start burning it, and then your first stint, it doesn't really give you as much grip, and you can't really extend it as much, or at least I can't, as much as perhaps I want to. So I've usually found that overfueling by about 2.5 laps usually does the trick. It doesn't really generate as much tire deg as, let's say, 4 laps or so would do.
Yeah, that's true. I generally just use around 3.5 to 3, and what I do is on the longest straight, and maybe some tracks have 2 long straights. I use rich there, and in the corners I run it on standard to like avoid the overheating, as Caesar said, and that actually seems to help me. I don't have any negative effect, and the delta in game, actually, when you overfuel the car and like when you underfuel the car, there might be a delta of like 10 seconds estimated, but I don't think that's true. It depends on each driver, I guess.
Sure.
And some might be affected by that and some might not.
Okay, I think we are moving into the region of the general conversation about how to manage your race, not just your ERS and fuel mix, but just to how be consistent when you're racing with everybody. And I think this is to do with how much you're losing time, or making sure how much time you're following. You spoke about delta there, Myth, following a delta, or basically just generally staying consistent in terms of what delta you prefer to stick to, and how your driving style perhaps personally affects that. I know there's certain things that I do slightly differently to each track, and I think the point about everyone having a slightly different driving style, taking corners differently, in order to maintain that consistency, they probably do different things. So is there anything you guys do? We spoke about the fuel and the ERS specifically, but in terms of I know Maranello spoke about taking turn 4 at Germany. Is there any more examples of little tips or tricks that you guys employ that I guess listeners could benefit from?
Yeah, I certainly have a very, very different driving style from, let's say, quali trim or time trial to the race. I think it's way more important to be consistent than it is to be quick. Even if you sacrifice maybe that half tenth or tenth a lap, it's still incredibly important that you hit the right braking points. And I think um, it comes down to this, right? A lot of people say that sim racing and racing on F1 or whatever it is about about feeling how much grip you have around the track. And to an extent, that is important. But I think Formula One as a sport is less about that than it is. I mean, that's what practice is for, right? To feel how much grip you have. Once you've kind of felt how much grip you have at different stages of, let's say, a stint, I think it's important to just log your braking points, make sure you hit the right apexes. I don't focus on space at all when I'm in the race. Think of pace as more of a byproduct of hitting the right apexes, getting the right exits. So even though I think when you're doing a 30 lap race, it's very easy to lose that little bit of concentration and lock up or go a bit deep, lose that corner, and then suddenly you've lost half a second or a second on your delta or on what you should have done. So I think, for example, let's take Caesar's example of Italy turn 1 and 2. I think if you manage to hit the apex in turn 1, take enough apex on the inside, and manage to get like a sort of like a cutback on the exit on the run up to turn 4, or sorry, turn 3, and through Cover Grande, you can gain a shit ton of time. And I think that was the difference between me being in the 19.0 to 18.7. So I gained about 2.5 tenths in time trial by just managing to take enough of the inside curb and getting a good exit on the run up to turn 3. So I know I spoke about time trial right now, but if you brake like 50 or 20 meters before where you normally would, and trail brake slightly more gentler, no, in a slightly more gentle way, you definitely gain a lot of time in race trim.
Yeah, even I agree with Manelo there about the racing. So what I do during races is like I just take it like a corner by corner. I don't focus on like going as fast as I can. In quali, you're always in that 110%, but in race, I generally drive around 90% or 95% of what I can do, and I just focus on hitting the apexes and like not making small tiny errors. And pace is obviously a byproduct of that, as Manelo said.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot. Just adding to that, and putting in a bit of the last topic that we were discussing about ERS and fuel management. Obviously, that also comes into play. Taking the right lines and how you manage your fuel and ERS, where you are saving them and where you are deploying them. I think that also helps in keeping the consistency up. But consistency, of course, one can put consistent lap if you are, for example, say in a midway point to a race and you are, probably a second off from the guy in front or who's behind you. But if you're battling someone, the scenario changes, of course. But then again, you have to play it really smart, and then you have to be consistent, obviously, in that as well when you're battling, because you don't want to battle them too much that you are getting attacked from other drivers who are further behind. So consistency, obviously, you have to manage when you're on your own and as well as when you are battling someone. So I think that's also really important. And I think every individual's driving style comes into play there as well. Uh, like Maranello and Amit said, that how you attack a corner or how much you are really pushing per lap of what you can actually do. That obviously really helps in getting the consistent lap times that you really want. And I think if you are around for example, since we are speaking of Monza, and I think if you're around 1.5 to 2.5 tenths within your fastest lap time, I think you are doing quite well.
Yeah, I think 1.5 to 2 tenths or whatever. If you're practicing in race trim and on race fuel, if you're able to keep that up, I think that's pretty good in terms of consistency.
Yeah.
Do you think setup is very important when it comes to consistency. I certainly find that,
Highly,
as Maranello mentioned,
highly,
I,
yeah.
I think that there is a massive difference between your qualifying and race setup, and that I think you must give a lot of time in practicing with the race fuel in a race trim, in how your setup um, helps you or doesn't help you according to your driving style in being consistent throughout, a race stint.
Yeah,
I'm sure
there's a lot of setup between your time trial setup, your qualifying setup, and your race setup. So, but of course, you have to first understand what each of the thing in the setup do. Of course, F1 is more of a simcade rather than a proper sim racing game because Codemasters want even the casual driver to pick up a controller and start playing the game. So uh, the setup is not too detailed as much as the other sim racers are, but still the setup is I think really important in this game. So um, the point that I made earlier when we started this, that you can't just go to the time trial leaderboard and load the fastest guy setup and expect to be as quick as that guy. You really have to tweak. Everyone's driving style is different. How they attack the corner, that's different. How they battle other guys on the track, that's different. So understanding the setup of how you drive, that's very important. And then how you can transition from, let's say, a qualifying scenario where you're just driving on your own as fast as you can to where you really have to manage your fuel, you manage your tires, you manage your engine temps. So I think setup really plays an important part to get a good result as opposed to maybe binning it in a midway through a corner or getting a result that you weren't hoping.
I
Yeah,
do agree, and I'll be the first one to raise my hand up and say that until at least a couple of months ago, I guess I was the one who was using the same setup, whether it was time trial, unranked, or even qualifying, or a full 50% race pace. And I have seen the difference over the last couple of months in terms of consistency, at least not being quick enough, but perhaps consistency at least in managing the tires, as to how much of a massive difference tweaking that setup and just understanding it can make. Sorry, Maranello, cutting you off there, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think that's a very valid. I remember doing a practice session with you in Mexico, and I think our setups are quite different.
Yeah.
Uh, but Caesar, on your point, I think a couple of things. One question I get asked very commonly is, what changes have you made from your time trial? So I think the most important one is probably roll bars. So roll
True.
bars, I tend to reduce
Agreed.
my rear anti-roll bar quite a bit, at least by two clicks. And in fact, I had a very interesting conversation with another American sim racer, and what he told me is that in USA, he used 1-1 for his anti-roll bars, and I was a little taken aback, and I was using something like 3-9, 3-10, but I was much quicker than him for the first 5 or 6 laps. And then as the stint progressed, he just got quicker and quicker on the soft stint. And by the end of it, he was right on my diffuser. So I think, and USA is one track where I definitely had the edge on him on pace. So given how that stint went, I'm convinced that I think you probably need to about turn it down significantly on the nature of the track. More rear than front. And the second most important change is probably tire pressures. Uh, that can be, I think, the higher if your tire pressure is too high on this game, then you're going to end up suffering. Even could be within 2 or 3 laps in China, Singapore, USA, whatever it is. Especially the tracks where you're using the softer compound tires to start.
yeah, even I agree with that. Tire pressures are really important, especially for like tracks like, for example, Singapore. I pretty much use like no tire. It's like all the way to the left. And
Wow.
yeah, that's what I do. And pretty much all the tracks I use only like 1 or 2 clicks from the left. So that's a big thing. And yeah, on the ARB, I always use around ranging from 3 to like 7. So for tracks like Silverstone, I use 5 7, I think, or 4 7. But generally in the race, I like to make it a bit understeery, so like lowering the anti-roll bar a bit. compared to qualifying. Obviously, you can't change that due to park for me.
Yep.
Interesting.
I think
That's really
I think your
interesting.
tire pressures also actually depend on your race strategy, Myth. I mean, if I start on the soft compound in Singapore, I'd probably turn it extremely like way down. But the softer or the lesser your tire pressure is, the more wear you're gonna get. So I
Yeah,
think,
yeah, obviously. Like,
yeah,
if I'm gonna use a hard tire, obviously, I'm not gonna run like none, you know.
yeah. So like I said, in Singapore, if I'm running a medium to hard strategy, which typically is the strategy most people opt for, I would probably run like a 22.1 and one click above none for the rear.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, but definitely that's something which I can only get by practice because it's important to, if you, like, depending on the device you use, for example, I think controllers get a bit more front tire heating. Caesar, you probably know more about that. But
Yep.
yeah, depending on the device you use, your driving style, you do need to do enough practice before you can find the right tire pressure.
True.
Okay.
Agreed.
Moving ahead from all the technicalities here, let's get into the generic, interesting question of racecraft and management
Actually,
of the race.
actually, before we move on, I think one thing we absolutely missed out on was wings. Uh,
Yeah.
I think aerodynamics is probably minimally changed, but it's important to have a car that's quick in a straight line. So I tend to keep my rear wing the same and just play around with my front wing. But there are some tracks where I do turn the rear wing up by one if traction is an issue during practice. So yeah, that's just it. But yeah, we can move on to racecraft.
So when it comes to to wings, I think it's a good feature that the game allows you to change your wing, or at least your front wing, at the beginning of the race from your qualifying, and that tends to help me sometimes.
Yeah.
Where I need some more aero for qualifying, but then because of the fuel load, obviously I want the car to be slightly more understeery, and I can tweak that at the beginning of
What
the
I
race.
usually do for that is I run the same as qualifying for the starting of the race, and as we come in for like the first or second pit stop, depends on the track, I reduce the front wing by one so that I can get a bit more straight line speed, and the feeling doesn't change because as your car becomes lighter, your understeer goes away a bit.
I actually do the opposite. I do
Yeah.
the opposite because I start with one higher wing, and the way that helps me is it kind of on the sorry, on the soft stint I reduce my front wing for the soft stint where I can get better temps. I think having a lesser rear wing, a bigger gap between your front and rear wing helps your tire temps a bit. So I tend to like reduce my front wing for the first stint, and before I move on to a higher tire which can probably take the load, I turn my front wing up by one just for that extra pace and turn in.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, probably something to experiment with.
Yeah.
Yeah, but don't
Okay.
you think aerodynamics has a correlation with the rear roll bar? I mean, the higher it is, it will help you to get that
Mm,
temps
I
up. So higher it is, that normally get the temps up, and more likely or not you'll spin out once you are maybe 4 to 5 laps in your soft spin,
bas
soft sprint.
Stint,
Yeah,
yeah.
what I think about that is, I think that the front wing and rear wing is more for like minimal changes, and especially for like high speed corners. And the arb is more for mechanical grip. So like, uh, your front wing can change with fuel loads, but I think the ARB is like it's more general. It can give you more, or it can make a more major change compared to the wings.
Fair. Yeah, I think it's all about practice and setup. Just getting a setup right in practice.
Nevertheless, great insight there, guys. Moving on back to the agenda, racecraft and race management. I think there's certainly a lot of things that everybody can learn when it comes to being consistent in race trim, or in race conditions. When it comes to racecraft, picking your fights, I guess, knowing what's happening in and around you on track, and also knowing what strategy or what tires and what sort of setup other people are on. I think all of those things can be used to your advantage in some way or the other. Um, let's start with you. Let's start reverse order this time around. Maranello, let's hit it off.
Yeah, so I think in terms of race pace, you heard what I do. It's purely mechanical. It's no feel. Just find the right apexes, hit them, uh, and kind of like um, just hitting the right apexes, getting the right exits. It's purely mechanical in all the practice you've done. Regarding racecraft, I found that a lot of drivers who shouldn't be fighting you tend to fight you along the way. I've done a few last to first challenges this season in some leagues, and I found that some drivers who know that I can probably pull them along for a lap or two with DRS have tried to fight me a little too hard and have probably gotten a few extra warnings doing so, or lost over 3-4 seconds to the car behind or the car in front. So the first thing is always figure out who you're fighting. It's no point fighting somebody who you know will either get you on strategy or get you on pure pace. So that's my first recommendation. Uh, know your audience or know your battles. Pick your battles. Got that right the third time. And in terms of race management, it's all about just um, deciding which laps to push, which laps to conserve. For example, Silverstone, it's important to push the first few laps either to break DRS or to hook onto the car in front of you for DRS. Um, in the mean, on the contrary, if in tracks like Italy, it's not if you want to trail a car for and save ERS for many laps, it's not worth being right on their diffuser. It's better to be 8 to 9 tenths behind them, just so that your engine doesn't overheat either. So there are a lot of different factors which factor in, right? Like your tire management, like manage your push laps and your chill laps, manage your fuel properly, maintain the right gaps, and yeah, hit every apex. That's what I do for the race.
Yeah, I agree as well with that. I think with your first point about what was it again?
It being purely
Right.
mechanical about just hit
No,
every apex.
no.
Not fight people who
Yeah, yeah, about
follow
that.
the same
I
strategy.
always see people like holding up others even though they're faster than them, and we forgot to talk about how it doesn't help both people. It's a lose-lose situation for both of them, and like it doesn't help the driver defending you as well. They're going to be losing time as well. For example, uh, if you pit for in to do an undercut and like rejoin behind say fifth place, and the fourth place guy, he tries to defend you, he's not really helping anyone because he has to make a pit stop, and trying to hold you up he might be losing 3 seconds or he might even get a penalty. So yeah, he's going to lose multiple positions, especially considering the midfield is like really close.
So that's a good point, and I largely agree with that. But if for example, in instances where I haven't taken a stop and I know that something might happen later during the race, or maybe if a safety car comes out and then we're bunched up together, then on pace I can beat somebody. Then I would probably fight a little bit too much, but not to the extent that I would jeopardize my own tires or my own, engine temps or my own race in any way.
Yeah,
Sorry,
that
just felt
that
like adding.
I think that's a point to where which is quite all right, and I think I would agree with both Amit and Maranello here that we all have come across drivers who are on a totally different strategy, but they will fight you as if they are fighting for the net position. But having said that, they are well within their rights to defend if they want. Of course, it's
Of
a
course.
lose-lose situation for both of the drivers, but you can't really, after the race, you can't really dictate to them that they should have moved, or they lost time because of them fighting. But then again, it's all about how you manage your own race. For example, if I'm slow and if I have Amit or Maranello behind me who are on a quicker strategy, I'm gonna end up losing more time. And maybe if I'm fighting someone who's around maybe 2 seconds behind me in positions, maybe I could come under attack with them within a couple of sectors. So it's all about how you manage your race and how you fight out your battles on the track. So you really have to know who you're fighting first of all. I'll just start this from the beginning because I haven't spoken on this part. What I do is my race strategy. It all begins from the qualifying grid and who I see who all are participating. Because if I see someone who's maybe 6, 7 tenths quicker than I am, then maybe qualifying. I don't push too much emphasis on qualifying because even still, I believe my race pace is much better than my qualifying pace. I have much better consistency. I can put consistent lap one after another. So know what your strong points are, and then of course you proceed. If you know that you have very minimum chance of getting pole to maybe none, don't fight for pole. Don't use up your soft compound tires. Maybe try to qualify somewhere around, at the midway pack of the field, and try to improvise on your race strategy. Because at the end of the day, the guy sitting on pole does not mean that he has won the race. People have won from back of the grid. So you really have to strategize how to make the most out of what pace you have compared to other drivers. And then again comes the point that you have to really know who you're fighting on track. You don't want to
Sure.
lose a lot of time while battling other drivers, even though you legally can, but you don't have to jeopardize your own race because the guy behind has already pitted and he's already pit stop ahead of you and he will be anywhere ahead. Doesn't matter how
Yep.
long you can hold him. But on the flip side to this, what point you made, that maybe safety car could come out and maybe extra pit stops can be made, but that's a big maybe and a big
Of
risk to
course.
take.
Of course.
You don't want to stretch your, maybe you want to
Yeah,
do 10 laps on softs, and in the quest of maybe a safety car, you are spreading that to 15 laps, and you're ending up losing 15, 20 seconds as a whole.
I
So
wasn't
yeah.
making
that,
that as a suggestion. That wasn't
no,
my
I'm
point.
just giving an example. I'm
That
not
was
saying
just
that you do it, or I'm just giving as an example of, I've come across such drivers who do that,
of
and
course.
at end of the day they're losing, or they're finishing.
Um, did we
Oh, is
lose
that
his?
just me, or I
Yeah,
think we have?
I think we lost Seasor there.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you're
Oh,
audible.
yep, it is now.
I'm
Yeah,
audible,
great.
yeah. Yeah, that's what I tell these guys after the race. Obviously, I don't shout at them
Of course.
because they're very much in their right to do so. But obviously, you have, if you want to be consistent and if you want maximum points next to your name, I think you have to know. You really should know who you're fighting out on track, and only then you can ensure that you're getting maximum points out of
Sure.
that race. So for me, it starts from qualifying. Look at the grid, see if you really have a shot at winning the race or maybe securing a pole. If not, then change your strategy and try to get as much point as possible. Win will come. Maybe guys at the front can crash out. Maybe late safety car can put you in the front. That's a different story. But in normal circumstances, just know your pace, know the reality of where you stand in the grid, and then make the most of it.
So I will agree with that fully. And I think we've covered a lot, at least what was on the agenda. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we haven't gone into. I mean, this can be an endless conversation. But I think let's try and move on to some of the other points that some of our audience members have been raising. So we'll start taking some questions. And I think the first question I can see here is, how do I go from racing lines or using racing lines to not using any racing lines? And I will add to that question, is it worth it?
I'm gonna take this if that's okay with you guys. So number one
Yeah,
is
sure.
it all depends on regarding whether you should take this. It depends on how serious you are. Um, it definitely takes a while to learn the tracks. The people who don't use racing lines are probably the ones who've been racing for what, 5, 6 years and are probably very quick at it. It does take at least a year or two to understand and be as quick at a as quick in race pace as you would be with the line with racing lines. But it depends if you have the patience, if you're serious enough about it, and if you want a future in esports. I don't know, but it's certainly. But in terms of how to go about it, it's important to do two kinds of practice, right? Time trial practice, where you first do a couple of laps with racing line on, find markers find markers either off the track or braking boards to stop the car at, and then try and replicate that for each and every corner. Something I've seen somebody do is actually use a flashback feature where you kind of kind of like do take the corner once with line, do a flashback, and then turn line off. So if you have the patience, if you have the patience for that, you can go ahead and do that. But yeah.
With regards to racing line, well, if anyone else has anything to add, please do. But I think we have another kind of question that lines up with the racing line question, and that's tracks will have different racing lines for different corners. And how do you go about improving or changing your driving style depending on the weather as well in using those racing lines? So just opening up the question a little bit more.
Yeah, so in the F1 game, it's a very weird. I don't know why it works like that, but then I still use Racing Line, and I want to obviously switch it off for F1 2020. But F1 is the only game which I use Racing Line, and it's probably because of the sense of speed. But I think it helps. It helps me for being consistent and being quick. If I switch off the racing line, I'm probably gonna be around 2 to 3 tenths slower. But I think as you get used to the track and as you get more accurate with your braking points and reference markers, you will definitely improve. And some tracks actually don't have the best optimal racing line in the F1 game. So like even though I have the racing line on, some corners I probably take a different racing line because it's mostly faster.
And I guess that just comes from practicing, right?
Yeah.
Or just trying out trial and error.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you think it's tough, if you think it's tough being quick and consistent, normally just turn racing line off and it's a whole different ball game. I think very few people have taken that challenge. Couple is one of them, but he's certainly felt the effects uh, in terms of his direct pace. So, yeah, if you've got the patience and where you normally have to put in an hour and a half every day, you probably have to put in about 3 hours every day without racing line.
Challenge
Okay.
for sure.
Let's move on to our next question, and that is how to game time during slow or very slow corners without traction. I'm assuming that's not about traction in race pace or due to your tires, it's without the traction assist, I think.
I believe so. Tanish, he's the Ferrari driver for Tier 2, so being MaranelloBaby, I'm going to take this answer. Um, it's tricky. It depends on it's a combination of two things, right? It's both the line you take as well as the amount of traction you have. So if you're on a wheel, um, you can you can kind of feather the accelerator to get that in the lower gear to get the rotation. And the moment you're, let's say, exiting the corner, you can do what Seasor said earlier and short shift up. So once you've got the rotation, you can then short shift. And but if you short shift too early, your car's just going to go straight on, and you're not going to get the turn in, and you're going to end up losing much more time than you would by just using traction control as an assist.
So I actually think this is this takes a lot of time to learn, and I personally actually never short shift. I always use the like optimal gear. So even for example, take Italy turn 2. I think most of the people short shift there, but then I don't short shift, and it's just about being able to feather the throttle and progressively or gradually accelerate, and that obviously takes a lot of time and practice. It's not something you can just follow a few steps and get it.
Exactly. I think on the start of the 2019 game cycle, I think Myth, you pointed out that I was short shifting quite a bit, and that's purely because I was quicker by doing so. But I think, um, like the more you practice and like I think it's important to like rev the engine out. Otherwise, you'd lose quite a bit of time on acceleration, quite a bit. So while learning, you can probably short shift, but try and use the extent of the entire rev range.
Yeah.
Great. Couple of more questions to go. One more we have from, I think, Faizan, and that's how to drive in wet. I am slow. Even if I brake early by a lot, I'm skidding going into corners.
Myth, why don't you
Well,
take
that
that? Okay.
depends. That depends on the assist he uses, which I'm totally not sure if he's on assist. But I think, yeah, braking, you have to really brake really early than what you do in dry. That's given. But then to manage your speed, it's all about throttle control through the corners. Uh, it's I've seen that a lot of guys you know either go full throttle or they just release it altogether. Um, to be quicker in wets, you have to, maintain maximum speed that you can midway through the corners, and it's all possible through the, throttle control that you have. So if you can manage that, if you know how to manage the throttle inputs that you do, if you're on a wheel or on a pad, I think you'll see, maximum increase again in your lap times.
Also, I think in wet weather, this is where short shifting really shines and where you can gain a lot of time using short shifting. I
That
don't
as
use
well.
it in dry, but I definitely do use it in wet. And also, in, I think he should start using more of lean mix or like non ERS if he isn't doing that already. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
I
So
think ride height also plays a part here. Running a higher ride height than what you do in your in your dry conditions. This is my personal opinion. I don't know if other drivers do that or not. But if I run 3, 4, maybe in dry setup, I bump it up to 4 or 5 on tracks like Brazil or Hungary, Australia.
Yeah,
Um,
obviously. Like, you can't use a dry setup in wet weather and expect to
Of
be
course.
very quick.
Yep.
Especially, you have to reduce your brake pressure. I generally if I'm running 85 and dry, I generally use around 79. I think lesser than 80 should be fine.
yeah, but I think if I look at the question exactly by Fivezan, I think the issue is more skidding going into corners. And that's probably
Yep.
because Fivezan, you're losing rear grip. And I think if you change your brake bias more towards the front, I certainly do that in the wet. I move it
Yeah.
one click towards the front. You'll probably find that your rear lockup doesn't happen as much. And I think what Casey's put in the comments as well, saying that you've brake only 50%, that can help, but I believe like getting onto the throttle 100% and trail braking faster is better. I know you use ABS, Fivezan, so um, it's imperative that you brake in a straight line. If you try and turn while braking in heavy rain conditions, you can say goodbye to that back end
Yeah.
and the back end of the car, not yours. Um, so yeah, that's just a bit
I'll,
on a few tips. Just
I'll add to that ever so slightly. I think obviously breaking in a straight line and then taking the apex or whatever. What I usually also do, in addition to bumping up the ride height a little bit in wets, is create a bit more gap between the front and the rear wing. So that makes my front end a little bit more understeery, and that kind of makes sure that I don't lose it as I'm in the middle of the corner. The back end, I don't lose the back end in the middle of the corner or on the exit.
Yeah, I do the same as well. And I also like make the ARB much lesser. I make the rear ARB like two clicks down, and that helps a bit.
I actually just put the both. I lower both, but I put them both the same. So I run maybe a 4-4 or a 5-5 on all tracks in the wets.
Interesting. Okay. Okay, let's move on. I think to the last question that we have. We've got a couple of questions, but I think the overarching theme is with regards to setups. So I think the first part of it is how do you go about setting up your suspension geometry? And I guess the second part to that question by Dipanshu is knowing what effect each and every thing in setup does, or how do you go about learning what effect things in setup have?
I personally just read everything already given in the game. When you hover on the setting, there's like a small guide to what it does.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to start. Like if you hover on the setting and you can just or you switch to that setting, you can see a brief description. It's a great place to start, and then once you put race fuel on, what you can test out the how a change in a particular setting or a particular part of the setup affects um, you on light fuel, on heavy fuel, and different aspects as well. There's no right answer to this. It's purely depends on the condition of your car. The wings you're running will adversely affect or positively affect the suspension geometry you currently have. And if you change the suspension geometry, you may need to change your wings completely. So, but suspension geometry um, is a tricky aspect. I believe it's not something that I've figured out 100%. Uh,
So also, I think the suspension geometry is not 100% accurate because, for example, the ride height, you should be able to get more grip as you lower down, but in some cases in this game, I've tried lowering it down and the rear end has actually become a bit more unstable.
I mean, I don't feel it's inaccurate. I just feel that we haven't gotten the documentation or the required exposure to understand it completely. I mean, the earlier so expectation was if you go full right camber and minto, you're going to actually get more rotation. But I think in this edition of the game, um, they've kind of made it a little more realistic. You can have different combinations. Like your camber actually affects the toe you're running at and the rotation your car has. But I think in terms of rotation, you probably want to go to the suspension side of things first, and then work your way to testing suspension geometry. There's no right setup, Masoom, but we I'll definitely give you mine for the race. It may not be perfect, but it's something.
Yeah, again, and then you have to work your way around that setup. Uh, Maybe Maranello's setup may not work for you, but if it does, well and good. But yeah, you'll have to obviously doing it as per your driving style.
Of course. And as
Okay,
Casey
great.
says in the chat, practice, practice,
Yeah.
practice, or it's all useless. I think I agree with that 100%.
What's useless?
He says practice, 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 or at the end of the day, all of this is useless.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean you have to sweat it out. I mean the term
Yeah,
that we sweat, it's sweat fest. So you have to really, just put in the hours if you want. And I think every quick driver that you see in the game at the top of the leaderboards, or maybe quicker drivers in IRC, they are there because they put in hours of practice into the game, and that's why they're there. And I personally have found a lot of pace. I started league racing when 2017 was about to end, maybe 2 3 months was left of that game. That's when I started online racing, not just league racing, but online racing. So when I look at myself back then and to now, I found a heap of pace, and it all comes down to how you practice with the game. So
yeah, we
you
probably said that like every topic we've
uh,
discussed.
yeah, basic fact is you have to sweat it out. There's no other alternative to that. There's no shortcut.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. I think this has been greatly insightful to everybody. Well, all of us here, but also everybody who's joined us to tune in and listen to whatever it is that we had to say, whether helpful or not. I guess any last points anybody wants to make before we say goodbye, or we just close it down?
No, let's just do some unranked after this. I think we are primed for a full IRC unranked session right now.
I
Yeah.
think everybody is heaving with a lot of knowledge and insights now to utilize it.
Hopefully, yep.
Okay, that's all four of us here, and we'll say goodbye. Thank you.